So if you've ever struggled with compression, EQ, multiband compression, reverb, parallel compression, delay, well, you just found the ultimate beginner's guide to plugins. So if you haven't met, I'm Jordan with MyAudioAcademy, and probably like you, I never went to school for audio engineering. Shout out to YouTube University. However, when you try to learn tips and tricks on YouTube without understanding the foundations, it's kind of like building a house, starting with the roof. So the bad news, I'm not gonna be your instructor. The good news, my mentor, Kevin Black Pearl McCloskey, credits like Lil Baby, Lil Baby, Giveon, Juice WRLD, and more will be. So I'm gonna go ahead and punt over to Kevin up at his studio in Charlotte, North Carolina.
What's up everybody? It's Kevin McCloskey back with MyAudioAcademy. I trim my nose hairs for this. And we're gonna be going over plugins today. Everything from EQs to compression to time-based effects like reverbs and delays, modulation, chorus and flanger. Super exciting, can't wait to jump in. EQs, what are they and why do we use them? An EQ is essentially a way to attenuate or boost the level at a specific frequency. So what does that mean? You know, attenuate means to decrease, boost means to increase. So we're increasing the volume or decreasing the volume at specific frequency points. In this module, we're really trying to get a good fundamental understanding of what we're doing. As we go later on, we'll do more of like EQ applications with sounds, but right now we're just understanding what the functions are, what the terminology is, and allowing ourselves to be more familiar and more comfortable so that there's less guesswork in what we're doing. So the first type of EQ, one of the most used, and from a digital perspective, one of the most useful tools that we have is going to be the parametric EQ. With the parametric EQ, it typically has a variable frequency, so we can choose what specific frequency, essentially slide between frequencies if we want. We can also adjust the slope or the curve of the frequency. There are parametric analog EQs that just simply have knobs. So some of like the channel strip recreations or emulations that we use, so like the SSL channel strips, the Neve channel strips, things like that. I'll pull one up to show you. Those are parametric as well, even though they don't look the same. But a lot of the digital EQs that we use, like the EQ 7-band or 1-band from Avid on Pro Tools, the stock EQ, as well as Pro Q3, the Renaissance EQ from Waves, those are all examples of parametric EQs. So here we have the Fab filter, the Pro Q3. We have all these different points, right? So we have a frequency spectrum, right? So lows, low mids, high mids, and highs. They each kind of have their own section. With the Pro Q3, we can really move anything anywhere. So if I grab this here, say I have it on a bell curve, I have this here, I can move this anywhere within the plugin to make adjustments. Things like the EQ 7-band from Pro Tools, you're somewhat limited in how far that frequency can slide. So the Pro Q3 is a really great one to use because we're not really confined to that. Let's talk about the shape of the EQs. A lot of times we call them curves. I'll show you what each one is and how they look. This first is a shelf. No, it's not a shelf. This is a filter. So this is a high pass filter or a low cut. So we're cutting out the lows with this. And if we do one up here, this is a high cut. The Pro Q3 is pretty intuitive. If I click up there, it allows us to have these filters if I do it far enough at the top, but we can change any of these. So you see here, so this is a low pass, everything below it, and also known as a high cut. So we're cutting all the highs, we're letting the low pass through. This is a high pass, we're cutting all the lows and letting all the highs pass through. The next type of curve that we use the most is a bell curve. So if we go here, we see bell. And what that does is it gives us the shape of a bell. And this is probably the most standard parametric EQ curves. The cool thing about a parametric EQ too with the bell is when we adjust the Q, you can really see how wide or narrow it gets, but we'll get to that in a second. The next is a shelf. And what a shelf does is a shelf allows us to boost or cut everything below or above that frequency depending on if it's a high shelf or a low shelf. In this case, I'm using a high shelf. So I'm boosting everything above the frequency point. Here it's at 5K, you're boosting 6 dB. You see it affects everything. If I have a high shelf at 200, it's gonna affect all the frequencies up above that. Same thing if we're cutting it. If we use the low shelf option, then it does everything below, right? So we're at 782, we see we're boosting everything below, 700, 800, and that's a shelf. And each one has its specific purposes. Shelves are great for, getting rid of some of the low end or boosting a little bit of the top end. Maybe if you don't have to focus on a specific frequency that's causing you a problem, shelf's a good option. Next up, we have notch. So a notch filter, a lot of times you'll see these in live music too, but they're used to pinpoint a specific frequency that's maybe harsh or building up. We don't use notch filters too often while we're mixing, But if you ever do run into a situation, especially mixing instruments where there's like an offensive frequency, it's a good way to eliminate it. You have bandpass. Bandpass is the opposite. It's not an option that you see a lot of times, but it's great to use these for something like even like a telephone effect if you want. It's kind of the same, but you can use multiple filters to kind of get this if you want. But on Pro Q3, it's an option. You're not always going to see it. Another one, which is one of my favorites that a lot of people don't know about, is a tilt EQ. And what that means is at the specific frequency point, it like pivots. So instead of boosting the top, which it does, dips the low while it doesn't. So this is a flat tilt, which is going to be your kind of standard tilt. As we boost that frequency point, the highs go up, the lows go down. So this is great to change like the pitch center on something. So say you kind of like the balance of it, but maybe you want your vocals a little darker in the mix, so you kind of use a tilt EQ and shift it. You find an EQ point where it feels good, where it makes the most sense. And that way you're not having to go through and like do a bunch of cuts here, cuts there. It's like, it's just a shift. A tilt EQ is a fun one to use. So let's dive into parametric EQing a little deeper and let's talk about Q or slope. The way Q works is the higher the Q, the more narrow the slope is. The lower the Q, the wider it is. Say we're mixing a vocal and there's an offensive frequency in there. Say we have something around 2.5K, we find it, and everything else sounds good, but there's just this little scratchy buildup or something like that's maybe just piercing our ears too much. Well, we can use a tight Q, so we turn our Q up, find what it is, we sweep the frequency, we find it, and we turn it down. And what that does is that can pinpoint the frequency, take it out, and then we can continue with what we're doing. So like a lot of times if we're trying to boost a vocal, right, to make it brighter, if we have some of these frequency buildups, especially in the top end, if we don't control those first, if we don't kind of pull those back at first, as we boost to get the brightness, the overall brightness that we want, because there's a buildup of those frequencies, it's like magnified, multiplied. And a good rule of thumb is to use a little bit tighter cues when you're doing subtractive EQing, which means you're attenuating or turning things down, turning frequency points down, and use a little bit wider EQs as you boost. So we wouldn't typically do a really tight cue on a bell curve and boost like that. If we want to get more top end or more frequency presence range or something like that, if we're boosting, we would typically do a little bit smoother curve while we boost. That's kind of just a typical pro tip for you. It's not the rules, but that's how we use it because it tends to sound the best. You can also do very wide. So if you want to do really musical things, like say you're on your mix bus or a drum bus and you just want more overall brightness, you could do a wide cue like this, right? So a lower cue, and it'll affect much more frequencies. Also, when we talk about Q works for filters as well. It works for shelves, it works for everything. It's just the steepness of the slope or the width of the curve, depending on which one you're using. So if we turn the Q up here, what it does on a filter is it adds kind of a hump in it. Now, if we need a more narrow filter, right? So say we've got this filter, but it's still allowing too much to come through, but we don't really want that point to go farther up to cut these frequencies. So say we want to stop it at 80, but it's still allowing too much low end rumble through right there. Well, we can change the steepness of the filter. The higher up you go, the steeper it is. And most analog gear will do it to 18, which is pretty steep. 24 is even more steep. Once you get past 24, you're really getting up into like sometimes an unnatural curve, which is fine if it sounds good, but be careful with low end when you do that. Things like usually 18, 24 range is about as high as you want to go if you want to maintain like the naturalness of the sound. But if it sounds good, it is good. I can't emphasize that enough when it comes to EQ. Also, if we're talking about shelves, so if we switch this to a shelf, we have a low shelf here. Also, if you ever see this, these are how they look. Here, they have the words, bell, low shelf, low cut, high shelf. But on some plugins, they only have the symbols. So here we have the option for a bell on the low end or a low shelf. Here, we have the option for a bell on the high end or a high shelf. And here, these are just simply bell curves. And then here are our filters, right? So we have a filter here, and remember how notch looked? These can be a notch filter if you want. So they don't say the word specifically, but understanding what we're looking at can help us when they don't specifically say. Yeah, and so that's typically how Q is going to work. Remember, if you're using it to fix problems, we're attenuating frequencies, maybe a little bit tighter. If we're using it to sweeten things, to enhance things, maybe a little bit wider. I do want to give you one more example of a parametric EQ, and it's one that we'll see a lot. So say I pull up a channel strip, and we'll go to the Waves, the SSL, EV2 channel. It's a cool, I've been liking this lately from Waves. I know there's a lot going on, but this section specifically, right here and right here, is a parametric EQ. The top end is a shelf, and the two middle frequencies are bell curves. The high and the lows have the option to switch between a bell or a shelf. If you activate that, then it's bell. If not, it's a shelf. And it says the same thing. So Q, right? So that's a tighter Q. Frequency, right here. And see how it's only in a specific frequency range. And that's kind of what I was talking about before. The Pro Q is very flexible. You can go anywhere with any frequency point that you choose. This, you have 4 options and they're in a specific range. And then you have your gain. So Q, frequency, gain. And so when you see a parametric EQ like that, that's how it's used. That's pretty much parametric EQing, what you'll see from analog emulations and also what we'll see in digital parametric EQs. The next type of EQ, which is a pretty cool EQ, is a graphic EQ. Depending on your age, I don't want to say my age too much, but you've probably seen graphic EQs in a car. So as a kid, you would see these, your parents may have a home entertainment system. You can go in and you can mess with each point, or if you're in a car, you might see like treble, bass, mids, right? These are graphic EQs. They are a fixed point, and all you can do is boost or cut. Sometimes when we have all these options, we can do too much. A graphic EQ is a great way to find a frequency point and figure out if you want to boost and cut it, and that's it. The way they work is they overlap. So when you're boosting and cutting, it still feels a little bit natural. You know, the API makes a great graphic EQ, the 560, and you just simply move it. And a lot of times with these graphic EQs, what will happen is the higher up you go, the more you boost or the more you attenuate, the tighter the curve gets. So instead of it always being like this and we're going up or down, as it goes up, as we get more, it does this. And as we go down, it does this instead of doing the same Q going up or the same Q going down. And you'll see a lot of plugins kind of emulate that too. These are a lot more straightforward. Sometimes they have a filter on them. A lot of times they don't. If you did want to use these in like a filter type scenario, you could just drop the lower one down as far as it would go, and it would, you know, kind of like this, and that would give you kind of the shape of a filter. You know, if you kind of look at it, if you turn your head to the side, you know, we could be rolling off the lows here, maybe a little boost in the middle, and then boosting the top end some more, you know, stuff like that. And then you're like, okay, I can start to understand what that curve is if we did it the same way on like a parametric EQ. Of course, the function's a little different, but if it gives you an idea, you know, it kind of goes low to high, it doesn't jump around. The last type of EQ that I think is really going to be useful is dynamic EQing. The Pro Q3 does a great job of it. What it does is it takes the signal, it analyzes the signal as it's playing, and you set a threshold. Once the signal goes over that threshold, then it starts EQing relative to that signal. Say we have a singer and maybe because of the room and because of their voice, there's just a little bit of like low end buildup when they sing like a lower tone, but it's not always in there. So we don't want to remove that. We want it to be in there when it needs it, but not be in there when we don't need it. And that's where dynamic EQing comes in. So what that means is that it's not static, that it moves with the material that's being fed into it. And on Pro Q3, what we do is this option right here will give us our dynamic range. So we can say, all right, well, we want to do 8 dB of attenuation when it hits. And we can click this little button right here and we can adjust the threshold if we want, or we can leave it off and it's set to auto, right? But if we adjust the threshold, we look at what's coming in and we see, okay, it's normally right here. We don't want any attenuation, but the signal comes up to here on some of those low notes on these when it hits this low mid. So we set it just above where it normally rides, and then we allow it to, when it goes over that, then it EQs. In the past, before dynamic EQing, we would split up sections of the song and EQ the song differently if it needed, or just those words differently. It was very tedious. This is a great option. It works the same way with boosting too. So maybe you have an instrumental and there's a clap in it, and you want the clap to be brighter, but just when the clap hits. So you kind of find the range that the clap's in, set your dynamic EQ, but you boost it as it crosses over that threshold, because the clap's a little bit louder than everything in that frequency range. It's not constantly boosting those, just for when the clap hits. Lots of different ways to use it, but it doesn't have to go down, and it doesn't have to go just up. Definitely dive deep into your EQs, mess things up, fail, then go back. A lot of times with EQs, as you progress, you start doing less EQing or more intentional EQing. When you start out, you might use 5 different EQs because every time you use a new one and a new compressor, you're hearing a new problem. It takes time. It takes time to develop your ears to where the frequency points are at, what sounds good, what doesn't. Also be careful with EQs, because if you do too many EQ cuts or too many EQ boosts all over the place, it can take some of the naturalness out of the signal. If you're going for that, cool. If you want more of like a natural vocal and you can't figure out why it's sounding so processed, could be too much EQ. You're doing too much EQ. Mess things up and then work your way back, being more intentional, and try to do it with less. And you should get pretty good at EQing fairly quickly that way. One thing that's important to learn and to develop as we EQ more and we understand EQing more, what are the EQ ranges typically? A lot of times you might hear terminology like low mids or highs or mid-range, and it's like, well, what does that mean and what are these frequencies? The first is sub. Human hearing, we can hear from The best humans can hear from 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. We usually can hear pretty low, but we start to lose it towards the top, maybe after 16 and a half, depending on if you've experienced loud sounds, loud music, and things like that. Things like about 20 hertz to 50 to 60 hertz are your sub bass. Think like 808s, or think like the low end of the kick drum. Next, you have your lows, and that's everything up from 50 until about 125, 150. Then you have your low mids, and that's everything above that, so about 200 to 500 range. These frequencies overlap a little bit too, so don't be like super rigid with these numbers. After your low mids, you have the mids, and that's typically 500 to 1,000, 1.5K. After that, we've got our high mids, and that's going to be around 1.5 to 5 and 6K. This area is where our ears are the most sensitive. Think about a telephone in this 1.5 to 5K range, but really 1.5 to 3K is where it's going to be kind of the most aggressive to our ears. So be careful in that 2 to 3K range with that. After the high mids, we have high frequencies, which is 5K on up. I like to break it off into like high frequencies being like 5 to 12K. And that's really like where we can still differentiate what's going on. If we boost around 10 or boost around 8. After that, you kind of have like air above 12. Things like 15 or 16. If you do boost those up there, it's kind of like, it's like a lift on it, but you're not going to really hear a bunch of what's going on, all the way up to 20. So, that's sort of the breakdown of sub bass all the way to the frequencies that we can't even hear.
So this video is one of the modules from one of our most recent training courses that we offer on our site. So we have some pretty sweet paid courses and memberships. However, we want to get you one for free. Down in the description, we've linked our completely free starter course to give you an inside look behind some of their hit mixes. You're going to learn Maddox's mix bus tips, how Kevin gets his drums to knock on a Juice WRLD record, and Prizzy's vocal tricks behind Do You Mind by Vito featuring Chris Brown. So definitely go check that out, completely free. Let's get back to Kevin.
Next up in our plugin journey is going to be dynamics processing. Things like compressors, gates, de-essers, limiters. These are hands down one of the hardest concepts to grasp, one of the most confusing aspects of mixing of pro audio, and one of the easiest ways to mess up. Hopefully I demystify these, deconfusify you, right? That's a real word. And hopefully give you a little bit better understanding about the different styles of compression and when they're typically used. Also, gates, de-essers, limiters, things like that. What we need to understand about compression before we even get into the plugins is, what is it? Compression essentially is a way to decrease the dynamic range of a signal. So the differences between the loudest portion of the signal and the quietest portion of the signal. What happens is we set a threshold and a ratio. And the ratio tells us for however many dB we go over that threshold, it will give us 1 dB of gain. So if we set the ratio at 2 dB and we have a threshold, the signal has to go over that threshold 2 dB to get 1 dB of gain. So an easy way to think about it is the higher the ratio, the more contained that sound is. The lower the ratio, the more natural the signal will be, and it'll allow it to kind of breathe a little bit more. The higher the ratio, the more it holds it in place. And if the ratio gets high enough, if it gets over 10 to 1, then it becomes a limiter. Another important thing that we need to look at when it comes to compression is gain reduction. The gain reduction, there's typically going to be a meter. Usually you'll see it go this way, but it can light up sometimes, or it could a light bar go down and it's not like little bulbs. It just all depends. But understanding like how much gain reduction you're doing. Also, it's really important to understand that this, just like with EQ, is based on sound. So don't get super caught up with like, oh, I'm doing 7 dB of compression. That's too much. Like, well, how does it sound? Sometimes it sounds good. The other parts of compressors are going to be your attack and release. A good rule of thumb is the slower the attack, the more the initial sound comes through. So if you're thinking about drums, like if you want the initial hit to come through on a drum, you probably want a slower attack. If you want a little bit more articulation in a vocal, you want a little slower attack to have that come through. When we talk about release, the slower the release, the more it grabs. I always like to think about it like a headlock. So if it's a real long release, it's going like this. It's clamping down on it. And what'll happen is with a slow release, it doesn't let go before the next transient comes in, or the start of the next word, or the next, if you're plucking a guitar or you're hitting a drum, you're getting artifacts of that when that compressor started on the next part of the signal. And sometimes that sounds good and it can feel like smooth and polished and lock everything in, and sometimes it can sound squished. And that's the hard part about compression. A fast release will put it in your face. It'll make things jump out a little bit more to you, almost feel like it'll give you more energy. But sometimes if you do it too fast, that it can pump. It's just something we're gonna have to go in and really experiment with when it comes to compression and limiting. In some later courses, we'll go through a little bit more in depth about, using compression for things like vocals and drums and whatnot. But we're just going to go around some of the basics and the basic compressors that we have access to in the plugin world. The first is the digital compressor. We have threshold, right? So that tells us at what level we want the compressor to kick in. Here's our attack, release, and we have ratio, right? So a lot of times with these, the ratio can go very high, 50-1. And keep in mind with certain limiters, like brick wall limiters that we use in mastering, they go to infinity-1, where it's basically like, nah, it's not coming over. It doesn't mean that you can't get distortion out of it, but from a digital realm, you're not going to be able to clip it. So we have a ratio, and then we have gain. The only other thing I didn't touch on before is how important gain is. So when we are using compressors, make sure that we're bypassing and unbypassing, right? So when we're gain staging, we have our levels at a good level. When we're using compressors, as we attenuate and we don't allow these to get over, it's going to make the signal sound quieter. And if we A/B them, we're going to almost always want to pick the signal that's louder. But if we're using bypass to say, okay, this is what the original signal sounds like, and this is what it sounds like with compression, we use this gain. A lot of times we call it makeup gain on the output to match the levels. And in that way, we can get an accurate representation of what's going on without psychologically tricking ourselves into thinking the louder one is better. Same thing like if you have too much gain and you're listening to the original one and then you listen to yours, the compressed signal might feel better because it's louder. So you really have to match those gains to make that decision and then work it from there. And that's pretty much all there is. Threshold, attack, release, ratio, and then makeup gain. There's a few more options on this, and you can fool around with those. You can switch it from like an opto or an electro style, warm versus smooth. I don't know if I hear a ton of difference, but it's subtle enough to where maybe it's a textural difference that may work properly for whatever song you're doing. So that's going to be your digital compressors. One of the most popular plugins are digital emulations of classic gear, sought after gear. The LA2A, the 1176, the CL1B. So here we're going to pull up an LA2A. And the LA2A, unlike the digital compressor, is an opto compressor. And what opto compressors do is if you had the actual unit, there would be a light on it, typically on opto compressors, or at some point there's a light cell in it. And what happens is as the signal goes through, once that light cell can't get any brighter, it attenuates the signal. And that's why it's called an opto compressor. This, you don't have a threshold. So it has a set threshold, which is the brightness of that opto cell. And you don't have attack and release. So those are set. What I would recommend with anything, go get a manual for these plugins. Just look it up. You could say, the Teletronics LA2A. And just look up the attack and release times. What the LA2A has is a medium slow attack, but it has a slower release. So it can go up to like a second on the release, but it's only about 10 milliseconds on the attack. As it allows, the initial signal to come through, and then it kind of holds it like we talked about before. So it tends to do better on smoother things like ballads, vocals, things that are more drawn out. It has a great texture to it as well, though. We just have the peak reduction, and we have the VU meter here and the gain. We have an option to switch between limit, which increases the ratio, I would assume, to a 10-1. So these are your options, on these, and then you can turn it on and off here. And these are different ways to look at the meter. So that's opto compressors. This is a FET compressor. FET compressors sound super good on vocals, especially stuff that you want more in your face. If you want to do like a slow attack, fast release. They also hold pretty well. They can smooth things out because they are faster attack, and you can make a little bit longer release. They sound really good on guitars. So here we have set ratios, so 4, 8, 12, 20. FET compressors too, a lot of them like to emulate this, but if you hold shift, you can do something where you push all the ratios in and it reacts like pretty crazy. It can be fun to try. A standard 4-1 is a good starting point. With these, a lot of times they like 12 o'clock. On these, I like to do it all the way so with the FETs, especially 1176, slow is all the way left, fast is all the way right, because it doesn't actually say slow or fast. And then these as well don't have a threshold. So you have to do the input to get the type of gain reduction you're looking to do and then pull the output off. FET compressors are really quick. They sound great on a lot of things. They're really great for like a rock sound, in your face sound, a lot of good hip hop stuff. They can have different characters, different presence. Some are smoother than others. Some like the revision A on these 1176s, they have a little bit more top end distortion, so they're great for guitars, vocals. Completely up to you how you want to use them. Next, we have VCA compressors. And VCA compressors are what we call a voltage control amplifier compressors. They work really well on things like percussive elements, drums. They work really well on mix bus. A lot of these bus compressors are VCA compressors. So this is like the SSL-G bus, also API 2500s. It's just a way that they decided to make the different type of compressors. And here we have the threshold, ratio, This is something specific to this about fade out, so don't worry about that too much. We have the makeup gain and attack and release. With modern music that we want to be a lot more punchy, especially because we're not going to tape anymore. We don't have to control the attack, or the punch as much. We can kind of go OD on it. We do a really slow attack on that and a really fast release, or we do an auto release. But they tend to have what a lot of people call polish. It's like glue and polish. So they kind of like make this cohesion to the overall track or to whatever you're running through it. Just be careful not to do too much with these, especially from a bus perspective. So like a drum bus or a mix bus perspective. The next type of compressor that we're going to run into is a Reverb. So mu is another word for gain. So it's just a variable gain compressor. The way their makeup works, when we talked about an LA2A having an opto cell in it, the Verimuse, they use tubes. Even though some of these other compressors might have tube components in it, they actually use like the valve or the tube to initiate the compression. And so it just has a little bit different sound, a little bit different texture. I always feel like Verimuse have a nice weight to them, but it's still the same thing. Remember, we talked about attack right here. And we have release, so this would be recovery in this one. And we have threshold, input and output. And then we have the option of limit versus compression. And there are a few other types of compressors. We're not going to dive too deep into those right now, but these are the ones that you're going to typically come across. They all work a little bit different, but they all kind of, if they don't have attack and release or threshold, maybe read the manual and figure out what they do. If they do, then you kind of already know how. And as you use them, you'll see, okay, is this too fast, too slow? Does this sound good for what I'm doing? And if it does, keep it. If it doesn't, we have other tools. As we continue into dynamics, there's going to be things like de-essers, gates, and limiters. Gates are a good way to control noise. You can also use them to get a little bit more attack on things, like a kick drum or a snare drum. But we're going to talk about typically using a gate for removing noise in a line. So say you're singing and there's like a little bit of a hum, low level distortion in the line. It's like, well, when you're singing or rapping, it's not an issue, but when you're not, there's just like this. Well, we can use gates, and what gates do, where you set the threshold, they can cut the sound off, or they can attenuate it, they can reduce it by a certain amount. You can control it, but typically we may say we set this, at -40, and everything below -40 you don't hear. We can also set the attack and release. A lot of times you have to feel it out with the gate, but 4 or 5 milliseconds on the attack, so it comes in. If you do it really quick, it'll snap. And that way you can use it like on kick and snares if you want to try it with a really fast attack. Same thing with release. You just want to make it natural. So with the release on a gate, as the gate kicks in, the release tells it how long it takes until you get to the desired noise floor. And here it's infinite, but say, we could set it at another volume, and it's good that we can see it here. But typically, like if you put it on infinite, it just cuts it all the way out. So how long the release is how long does it take to get to that point. The longer the release, the more it fades out into it. The shorter the release, the more it kind of just abruptly does it. Now, if you do it too abruptly, you can get distortion, you can get some other stuff, so you just kind of have to fill it out. And then hold is, once the gate decides to start activating, hold allows the sound to come through for a certain amount of time. Say you had a snare and it had a reverb tail on it. So the reverb tail is lower than the snare. Once the snare hits, you want the snare hit to come through, and then you want the reverb tail to come through too, but you want to do an abrupt stop on that reverb tail. So like that kind of sound, right? So clap instead of which is like a natural or a longer release. If we have a fast release on it and we have to put the threshold on the gate to where it's actually going to activate, it won't hold it out long enough to get this effect. So that's where the hold comes in. And the hold sometimes can help if there's maybe a little bit lower sound than the threshold, but you don't want the gate to just cut that one off real quick. Like you need like a little safety net. The hold is a good option for that. The next is a de-esser. So now we're getting back into the compression side of thing. And what a de-esser does is it's made specifically to control sibilance in a vocal, or technically things that are ranges of about 2K and above. Typically they start out about 5K but can go down to 2K, but it's really a multi-band compressor. And so what that means is that it doesn't attenuate or compress anything below. It's only triggered by what's above, usually in about the 5K range, because that's where our S's are the strongest. We don't really have an attack and release on this. It's more of kind of a set it and forget it, but we use it all the time. As we boost signals, the S's are going to jump out. And so this allows it to, every time the S's come, that it ducks them back. And we still have a range here. You may not want to make your range too much, but maybe around 6 to 7 is a good starting point. And then you adjust your threshold to where only when the S's are hitting, it comes in. And always make sure you're listening to it. But here we can change the frequency of it, right? So we can take it down to 2K, or we can go all the way up to 16. And then we have the type. So this is where we can actually just do a specific frequency, but typically you would use it in this form, like a shelf. But sometimes you may just have like a random buildup at like 3K and you just want to move it around and say, hey, you know, I'm just going to dip this. Whenever that random frequency hits at 3K, we set our threshold and it just hits that. You can use multiples of these if you want, different frequencies, whatever floats your boat. That's really how a de-esser works, which I think is a great segue into multiband compression. Even though they all look different, we're still talking about threshold, attack, release, gain. The de-esser was a little bit different. Don't worry about that. So what a multiband compressor does, it allows us to compress specific frequency bands without affecting the others. The de-esser is a good example of a multiband compressor that only affects the top end. That's the only option that we have with the de-esser. But other multiband compressors like the C4 or the C6 from Waves can do any frequency point. But remember, we've got gain, we've got attack and release. Here's our threshold for each one, right? The only difference is that we have a range. So think about like the gate. So with multiband compression, we can say, okay, well, we want this to react a certain way, but we never want to go beneath, in this case, 8 dB of compression. We can do it all the way down to 24. Or we could say, you know, I'm just going to use this very slightly to control a little bit of buildup in the low end, and it won't go between 1.5. But the other cool thing about a lot of multiband compression is that they also have sort of an EQ element where you can do boost, right? So if we want to boost the top, say we're having like some low mid buildup, and we want to boost the top, and say we have a vocal, we might make it like that. And where we're like, okay, this is just riding these low mids that we talked about earlier in our frequency ranges. And whenever there's a little bit of the buildup, kind of like with the dynamic EQ, it attenuates it. The cool thing about these two is like we can bypass. So say we want to use it as a corrective thing and not an enhancing plugin. We can just bypass this right here. We can bypass these other bands, leave this one open, and now, boom, we adjust the threshold and it attenuates that. If we got rid of all these, each one is just a compressor for a specific frequency range. It's still the attack release are the same. You've got makeup gain on it. You do have the range option on this plugin. Another thing that's important to talk about too with a lot of these digital compressors is you may have the option to have a knee, right? So we might see that where it says knee. So we've got a hard knee or a soft knee. Soft knees, lower numbers, hard knee, higher numbers. A hard knee means it only kicks in. The compressor only starts working when it crosses the threshold. A lot of times you use a hard knee on things like percussion, because if we have a slower attack, we want that initial transient to come through. With a soft knee, what happens is it reacts, it's a little more curved. So hard knees like this is what it'll look like. Soft knee, it'll look like this. As you approach the threshold, before you actually hit it, the compressor starts engaging. And then that way, it gives it a lot smoother. So for things like vocals, a lot of times we'll use the soft knee. But having the knee, like a soft knee and a hard knee, especially on a digital compressor, will give you a lot of different textures. Right? So we can kind of use those compressors to make a snare pop, or we can use that same compressor to make a vocal smooth. So understanding what all these aspects of the compressor do will help you use that tool and get the desired result. Lastly, in the dynamics section, what I want to talk about is limiting. So we talked about it before, right? It's a high ratio compressor. But when we're using limiters in the sense of like a finished product or in mastering, we use something that we call a brick wall limiter. I touched on it before, but brick wall limiting is when the ratio is pretty much like an infinity to 1. So you cannot go over what this threshold is. And they work really great at getting the desired loudness that we want because they're kind of always doing this makeup gain. As we lower the threshold, it's kind of pushing up into it as opposed to reducing it back down. And then our output ceiling, if we keep our output ceiling at the top, like a negative 0.3, then we'll be able to get it to the loudest that we can possibly get it. And that's sort of like what's going on with the loudness war. But we'll use these limiters at the end of a master chain to get a desired sound, but we can also use it in a mix. You know, if we just don't want something to go over a certain amount, we can really lock in things like, say, an ad-lib. So maybe you have an artist that's doing loud ad-libs, soft ad-libs. A limiter is a great choice because you don't have to go in and focus on correcting each one as much. The limiter will just catch it for something that's not, you know, make or break for the song typically. But these are going to be pretty much what you're going to run into for standard dynamics processing in a lot of sessions. So we have our digital compressors, our analog emulations, and gates, de-essers, multiband processing, and then limiting. Next module, we're going to talk about different effects. So we use effects for a lot of different reasons. It can be to create a space or a specific vibe. It can also add dimension and add depth to the mixes. These are typically done as a send but they can be put in line, which means like as an actual plugin on the audio file, or if we talk about a send, sending a portion of the signal to a reverb or to a delay. We would do it as a send to try to save CPU processing so that we can send multiple audio regions and different channels to it. But like I said, it's okay to get creative with these. Just understanding how they work is what's most important about this module. We've got reverb first. So what is reverb? Reverb is basically digital recreations of specific types of spaces. A lot of times you'll have hall, church, plates, ambient reverbs, inverse reverbs, nonlinear reverbs, chambers. It's our job to take these reverbs and create an atmosphere for the song. A lot of times it might be on vocals or guitars or anything like that. Sometimes drums. With all these reverb emulations, we typically have options. What we have to think about is how do we intend the listener to hear this or to perceive what we're doing? Do we want it to feel like the vocals way far away underwater, or do we want it to feel like they're right here with it? How we use reverb, especially if we're having a flat recording, is what's going to dictate a lot of that. As we look in plugins, here I've pulled up the Deverb. It's just their stock reverb. There's some very typical options on a reverb. So you have what type of reverb it is. So we have hall, church, plate, 2 types of rooms, ambient and nonlinear. We also have size, right? So small room, medium room, large room. Some reverbs will give you the option of early reflection sizes and things like that. And that can affect, the perception of the size of the room. In this case, they simplified it and just gave us the option to choose small, medium, or large. And then we have decay time, pre-delay, a high filter cut, diffusion, and dry wet, also a low pass filter. So what these are ways to manipulate the signal once they come in. One of the most important is going to be decay, and that's how long the reverb lasts. So after you say a note like ah, the decay will be like ah, or for however long you want, ah, that's a short decay. The withheld a or the ah, that's a long decay. It is important to choose an appropriate decay for the song, because if your decay is too long, it can get in the way of a lot of the other words. Another very important aspect is going to be the pre-delay. And what the pre-delay does is it's a delay from when the signal comes into the plugin to when it actually sends the reverb out of it. If you're singing or rapping or playing a note, the longer the pre-delay, the longer before the reverb starts. So it's like a delay in the starting of the reverb. If you have it at a 0 millisecond delay, it's a lot like, say you're in the audience of an auditorium. With no pre-delay, the singer is going to sound like 50 feet back from you because you're in the middle of this auditorium. The more you add pre-delay, the longer the pre-delay, the more it feels like that person gets closer to you, because you hear the dry signal first and then the reverb comes in after, comes from behind. So it's as if they're closer to you, you're hearing the direct signal, and then the reverb, it comes in after that. Another aspect of it is the filters or the cuts on that, and that's basically a reduction in the high frequencies. If you don't cut off the high frequencies, that's fine, but it's going to be splashier. There's going to be more detail in it. A lot of times when we hear natural reverb, it's not super bright. But if you do want more of an effect reverb or splash reverb, you can take the filters off. You can boost the high end on the EQ. You can do lots of things. There's no rules. The next option is diffusion. Basically, the higher the diffusion, the more echoes are involved, or the more reflections off surfaces this is emulating. So you get more of a wash with it. The lower the diffusion, the more almost specific it sounds, the more you can actually hear the walls better. Like you can hear like there's one wall there. Whereas like the higher the diffusion, it could be coming from everywhere. We could be getting reflections off of everything. It's just really to taste. With this, you just have to adjust it to see which one you feel fits your song better. There's not a right or wrong with it. But diffusion essentially is the amount of echoes that you're perceiving in the signal. On here, we have a dry and a wet. Typically, if we're using it as a send, the wet is 100% of the processed reverb. The dry is 100% of the unprocessed signal. If we have it in line, so if we're actually putting it on an audio track, we're going to want that dryness to come way down. Or we're going to need that at like 10, 15%, 5% potentially. Whereas if we're doing it as a send and we only want the effect, we need to do that at 100%. And so this is going to be very typical with a lot of reverbs. The main thing to focus on is the type of reverb that we're doing. So each one's going to have a little bit different characteristics. They're going to have different decay characteristics, different diffusion characteristics. There's a lot of reverbs. When you dive into them, you can do things like a tile room, a wood room, chamber, different types of halls, a clean hall, a dirty hall. Reverbs are really essential with what we're doing, but it's something that you kind of have to dive into and figure out what works best for each song. We can't just say, oh, you need a plate reverb on this or a hall reverb on this. The next super useful plugin that we use often are delays. Another word for delay is an echo. Essentially, the sound comes in, it delays it for a certain amount of time, and then repeats it back. If you think about what reverb Reverb is just delays at different times, at random times, off different spaces. A lot of times we can use delays not always as just like an echoing effect, but as a space type effect. We have different types of delay, but your two probably most common, or three, are going to be like just your typical stereo delay, which you might use for echo type effects. Another typical type of delay is going to be your ping pong delay. And what that does is it goes from one side to the other. So as it delays, you hear it left, right, left, right. They're not going at the same time. Another might be a slapback delay, which is similar to what we were talking about with pre-delay on the reverbs, but it's a very short delay, maybe anywhere under 150 milliseconds, maybe a little higher depending on if you want more of an effect. That one kind of gives you like that rock club sound, like where somebody sings and you can hear it smack against the back of the room. That is a slapback delay. I've pulled up the H delay here, which is a really awesome delay. So one of the things that you typically have the option of is you can go to the host, which here, if we look up our tempo, we have a tempo at 80. So what this will do is this will lock in the delays in time. So we can choose between, this is like a dotted eighth note for anybody that knows music theory, but a quarter note triplet, dotted eighth note, we have eighth notes here, and then it kind of goes through in that increment. So triplet, dotted, the next increment down. So we've got eighth notes, 16th notes, 32nd notes, it goes the other way, quarter notes, half notes, whole bar. And this one can even go to 2 bars, I believe. Well, it doesn't want to let me do it, but it says 2 bar here, so talk to Waves about it. Another option that you can do is if you don't know the BPM or don't understand that, you can go to milliseconds and you can just kind of dial this in, and it's continuous, it's variable, whereas it's more stepped when it comes to the BPM, meaning that each time you turn it, it goes to a specific point. But with this, being variable, we can slide it everywhere in between, and so you can find a point that fits better. Another great option on this, but not all delays have it, is we have tap. So if we don't know the tempo or we want to do it on our own, we can tap it. So, all right, so 367 milliseconds is how fast in between, these taps were. Another good thing on these is a high pass and a low pass filter. So we've talked about these a little bit, just essentially EQing, but we can make it more natural. We can make it brighter or darker. The brighter it is, the more noticeable it is. The darker it is, the more subtle it is. Be careful with delays with a lot of low end. It can interfere with bass and kick. They also may have a modulation option, which kind of does sort of like a phaser, chorusy, flangery type. Depth is how much it's doing it, so almost like a dry wet. And then rate is how fast that modulation is, so we're modulating the signal. If you want to go for a cool effect, you do a higher rate, but it's going to be very noticeable. If you want to just add like very subtle texture, you want to do as little as possible. And it just helps it move just a little bit, makes it a little more exciting. Then the last thing is the feedback. And what the feedback is how many times the delay repeats. So with the short feedback, we're going to use for something like a slapback. It's going to be one time. But the longer you do it, the more continuous it gets. And after a certain point, it almost never stops if your feedback's too high. If you're using it as like almost a reverb type texture, maybe not as long, you want to do a shorter feedback. Whatever feels good. It's more blended taste here. There's not a rule with it. And then you have your dry wet. So if you put it in line, you can do it as just like we did reverb with a little bit here. If you're using it as a send, which I recommend, do it all the way wet. That way it's 100% of the signal. And then you just have your standard output that you can make adjustments on if you need. The next we're going to talk about is what I like to call dimension adding plugins. So things like chorus, doublers, things like flanger. These are really cool effects, but they're just that effects. Like you don't always need them, but if you do need them, they can really help you get a little separation, a little bit of depth. Or if you need a really cool effect, things like flanger does a great job. So here we have a doubler, which is also, a type of chorus, but essentially what's happening is it's analyzing the signal and then slightly detuning it. In this, we have an option to pan and do different volumes. So this is the doubler 2 from Waves. They have a doubler 4. There's also like a slight EQ, but here, we can pan these closer or harder, or even like to one side if we want. The delay is how long before the delayed signal plays. So you can do like really long, 100 seconds, almost like slap back type stuff. And then what kind of gives it the effect too is that you can detune it. So that it's slightly detuned up, slightly detuned down. Not enough to where our ears, like where we really hear it, but what it does is we notice a difference in the sound. So we can use these for like chorusing type effects. Doublers, they're really good to run. You don't really want to typically run them in line. You want to run these as a send, but you can if you want a weird effect, run them in line. Another good example of like a chorusing type effect and even like a whip type effect is Microshift from Sound Toys. That's a really cool one. Anybody that plays guitar is probably familiar with chorus. And it's just like adding detuned versions of the same signal to give it dimension and depth and a little bit different sound. Another one that we use a lot of times is flanger. This is the meta flanger, which is a classic flanger, great flanger from Waves. It's been around for many, many years. You know, you have the mix, the dry wet, the feedback as well. But really what you want to focus with on the flangers is basically the mix. Here you can change like the style of it, sine versus triangle. It'll just give you a little bit different characteristics. Triangle will be kind of like more direct in how it's shifting the pitch, because it basically runs the original pitch and then it bends a pitch up and down around it. We have rate. The slower the rate, the slower the flange will happen. The faster the rate, the more it'll even wobble. So like we can see here where it's moving super fast, it'll, you know, be like, sorry, but you know, we'll hear it fluctuate a lot more. And then as we move it slow, we can see it, the flange will come in and out. The pitch going up and down will come in and out. This has a cool stereo width option that we can use too. Each flanger kind of has its own thing. Mess around with it. You might find one you really like. You might find some that you don't. These are really just kind of ear candy type effects. If we're using them subtly and if we're using them in a heavy sense, these are going to be a little bit more drastic and sort of unnatural sounding. So then there's also like certain effects that mess with the sound field that can do different panning effects and things that can move around. If we go to sound field and we go to something like, we could use Pan Man, or we could use this Fielder audio stage. Fiedler audio stage. You can change the positioning in the room, you know, the size of the room, the amount of feedback, how things are panned, how much width. We can add color. There's a lot of different options that we have with these like kind of crazy spatial effects or modulation type of effects, but they're going to typically be, you know, chorus, doubler, flanger, maybe even ensemble. Sometimes you might hear, and then different type of panning, those type of things. So those are great effects to jump into.